do that now, Greg? Or no?
Okay, Todd, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Greg.
Welcome, everyone. This is Greg Luikwan. Today, I have the honor of introducing, on behalf of the Senior Council Division, two speakers on the topic of senior residential living facilities, Percy Ihara and Todd Pang. Percy has been one of our go-to people for many years on anything dealing with the choices we as seniors face in our golden years. For those of you who are not familiar with Percy, he is a certified senior advisor in long-term planning, the publisher of Generations magazine, and a reverse mortgage specialist with Reverse Mortgage Funding LLC, a leading reverse mortgage banker. Percy is also the creator and producer of the Aging in Place workshop, where for the last 14 years, he has educated thousands of seniors and their families about how to use reverse mortgages and other devices to successfully manage aging in place. And his reverse mortgage is not for everybody, and Percy will be the first to tell you if it isn't. Todd Pang has a broad background in tourism and elder care. For several years, he worked overseas in China's luxury tourism industry, but since 2010, Todd and his family have operated two different side-by-side facilities on Beckwith Street. Todd, is that correct? In Manoa?
That's correct.
And the company's name is Caring Manoa LLC. As I understand it, that is a type 2 adult residential facility, which is meant for adults who are largely independent but require assistance with some activities of daily living, such as bathing. And again, Todd, would that be accurate? I'm sorry, I don't want to misstate this in your introduction.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get stuck in the weeds, but that's pretty accurate. You're right. But we do handle residents who are not independent as well.
I see. Thank you. And the reason that Percy has invited Todd to be presented today is because Todd is the founder of Kupuna Care Pair, which is something that he's worked on for the last 10 years. It is, as I understand it, and Todd can correct me if I'm wrong, an online platform that helps seniors decide, comparing one facility to another, which ones are best suited for their care needs, their budget, and their personal preference. And without further ado, please welcome our presenters for today, Percy Ihara and Todd Pang.
Thanks, Greg. Unfortunately, my neighbor here in my house goes off and on trimming the hedge next door to my house. So I have to move back into my kitchen here. Yeah, Todd, why don't we go ahead and start the presentation?
Yep.
It is a high-level presentation, PowerPoint. We will be able to send it out to you folks, but please be careful in terms of using it as that something can solve every situation. As Todd and I will explain later on, every situation is very different. Every family's financial situation, communication, the health, everything maybe is specific to that family. So it's a general overview, and this is Todd's presentation. He did a fantastic job. I mean, I was really impressed when I first saw it when Todd did on my radio show last month, Generations magazine radio show. But yeah, Todd, why don't you go ahead and move that? You can move the next slide.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Percy and Greg, for that introduction. That's a really good start. This is going to just be a very high level talk about what's available, and what you see here is the entire spectrum of licensed facilities and care services. We're not going to talk too much about the ones in red right now because those aren't really residential. They're also, not typically longer term options that people like to think about. So we're going to focus on the other colors here and dive right into it. It's a lot of info, but it's just meant to be very high level. Here you can see home care. In the yellow, that's going to be your main value proposition for this type of care. So home care, for instance, it's about staying at home, right? And it's otherwise known as aging in place. Sometimes people call it that. But you'll see, there's pros and cons to each of these types of arrangements. And I'm I'm always the first one to say a care home is not for everybody. So home care, as the name suggests, is you stay at home. You can be very flexible. It's the ultimate flexibility. to be at home and to be cared for at home through however long one can stay at home, but you have to, be adequately safe. And that's one of the downsides of home care, is that there's a real risk of lack of stimulation. I see that constantly with families who say, well, my mom really wants to stay at home, but it might potentially be too boring or too dangerous. My mom actually just watches TV all day. So there's risk of lack of stimulation that can actually have some health effects. There's also, risks that the caregivers might be inconsistent or unreliable. And when somebody needs 24/7 care, we are talking big money for that. So, those are some of the downsides of home care. I'm not going to get too into the weeds here of what is included and not included, but standard services that all home care agencies provide are, definitely that assistance and maybe some meal prep, but other agencies may or may not charge for outings for that meal prep. They don't, they usually charge a bit more for meds. And it is different from something called home health, which is a temporary rehabilitative service. So that's home care in a nutshell. I'm going to kind of breeze through the rest of these because I know it's going to just be too much for you to handle. And I just want you to really remember that what's in here in the yellow, which is the main value proposition. So adult daycare is going to be some sort of facility or center where the seniors will go to and they can really socialize and have a day together. Some people have called it going to school. It actually really resembles going to school. And I've heard of people explaining to their parents, especially with who live with dementia, hey, mom, it's time to go to school, because it really feels like that. It's a fun, lively, engaging atmosphere where people can socialize. And typically in adult daycare, we're talking residents who are able to still return home at night. So they're going to not really need that much assistance. The downsides of home care are very much due to that level of, the downside of daycare is much due to the level of assistance that somebody needs. So once somebody is actually requiring more help hands-on, a daycare program is not really set up for that. And, not all, some will operate on the weekends. And one thing that people tend not to realize about daycare is that depending on a person's needs and cognitive state, the daycare might be a little bit too overstimulating. There may be a little too much action, just like, in the cafeteria, some seniors will exclude other seniors, which can feel very, sad. And so those issues do come up in daycare. They can be mitigated by the size of the program. Some daycare programs are only 5 people, and so it feels very intimate. Whereas like something like Central Union, for instance, has, I think, about 60 to 80 participants. So it's a different size there.
Todd, let me interrupt real fast here. So what we're seeing as well, the adult day center, the adult daycare industry is really growing because that's really the first line of defense if you can't stay at home 24/7 or your daughter or son is working. So what they do is like Todd said, like school, you'll drop them off in the morning, you pick them up in the afternoon, comes with a meal, it's safer, and the value is there. It runs anywhere from $65 to $9 a day, all day, including the meal. Some do excursions, but Todd's right, the level of care is limited to a certain extent, so you really have to take a deep dive into every facility. A lot of times it's where you live or on the way to work, but you want to take a deeper dive when you ask questions about the type of care, the quality of care, the ratio of care to the patient, the client, and what kind of special needs that your loved one may need. Can they address that? For the men that go to an adult daycare facility, can they be lifted if they fall down? Do they have a male around there? Are they trained in fall prevention? So it's really important to understand that. But we're seeing a growth in adult daycare facilities here, because that's really one of the first places people go. If they can manage that, and if the facility can manage that patient, client. So it's really important to understand that everyone's different. Everybody has a different idea of what the quality of care means. So But that's a great start right here. So
I
thanks, Todd.
totally agree with Percy. I mean, I'm a huge fan of daycare programs because it's kind of like getting your feet wet. And, you know, many kupuna, they've been living in their home for say 40, 50, 60 years. And it's scary to think about leaving home, right? So daycare is a really great foray into getting out of the door and keeping active, which can actually prolong their period of time that they can stay at home. But it's really a good introduction because families get to kind of see how their loved ones interact and how they'll adjust to being away from the home, and then they can kind of tailor their approach accordingly. You know, some family members feel like my mom is just, you know, she doesn't want to leave the house, but then when she does go to a daycare program and it's fun, she actually opens up. And so I'm a huge fan of daycare, and as Percy says, it's a really growing field, which has got a lot of great benefit to it, especially because of the value for
Yes.
8 hours a day. Now, independent living is sort of like group living. Imagine like, I think of it kind of like a dorm, you know, with a senior dorm. And at the very lowest end, you have places that are just kind of really just senior housing. I should say independent living facilities are unregulated. There are, you know, some groups like DBED has a branch, and I can't remember the name off the top of my head right now, but they do manage the listing for that. And you go from small ones, which might have like 10 seniors living together with a bit of service involved, like chore or housekeeping or meals. And then there's the bigger ones that are attached to like a assisted living facility. So we're talking the Plaza or One Kalakaua or Arcadia, you know, they're attached to life care facilities. But they are completely unregulated, and the assistance is not very high. So most of the residents are required to be independent and only need assistance when there's an emergency. It's a very lively space, but you know, some of the downsides is that depending on the size of it, you know, some people really do feel excluded. I was talking to my friend whose Popo is 106 right now at One Kalakaua, and you know, Popo loves the place, but nobody wants to sit with her in the dining room because they can't really interact, right? And so the size of a facility really can make an experience. And the other issue is that if it is, say, the Plaza or Hawaii Kai's retirement, the independent living section is required to be separate from the assisted living section. And so if I'm in independent living and then I need more care and I have to move for one, and then maybe I don't get to see my friends as much because now I'm in assisted living and they are still in independent living. But it is also a really great cost-effective way for people to receive services that they don't really need to or want to do anymore, like cooking and housekeeping. And then as they need more care over time, then they can kind of either explore the assisted side or maybe think of something more residential. Percy, anything you want to add?
Oh,
about
that's
that?
right. I recommend everybody take a visit in person.
Yep.
A tour. I also recommend you try the food. Certain locations of the dining room may be further than closer, which is good or bad depending on how independent you are. At some point down the road, if you need a wheelchair, how is that accessibility? Some places have monitors in the room or a necklace even for independent living. So it's really understand all the services involved, and then that's when you decide. But socializing and group living is not necessarily always the best. I have an auntie that I would visit, and then once a week or twice a week, she'll eat by herself. I said, Auntie, why is that? You're so popular here. He goes, well, there's some days I just want to get away from all the gossip. So I'm sure a lot of you have experiences with your own family, but it is so true. I would bring her furikake or chocolate chip cookies because she likes sweets. You know, as you get older, you lose your taste buds besides your hearing and vision. But taste buds is huge, and food for local people is really big. And so I have another friend that would say, oh yeah, my son always brings me some child fun and maybe and sometimes some roast pork or char siu, because he wants to eat that when he wants to eat it. You know, but the dining facilities and the food at almost all the facilities are fantastic. I've been to just about every one of them, and I always recommend, I need to try the food, and it's great.
I agree. I mean, it's they have very professional kitchens. They have snacks available at other times. I mean, it's almost like being in a cruise ship that you can leave, of course, but like it's, you know, it's full service. And one of the things that I always encounter with families is that they say, well, you know, dad is, he'll just take his meals in his room. He feels a little uncomfortable going out, and, you know, that pressure of having to socialize or the gossip, like Percy's saying. And at that point, then, you know, the family really ought to ask themselves, what real benefit are we getting in this environment now that my dad or my mom really doesn't feel comfortable with that kind of social interaction, or there's just too many people. So that's a big part of this that we'll talk about in a little bit.
One more note about that,
yeah.
Todd. I
Yeah.
counseled several hundred families, and what I noticed especially is that for individual men who are not married or widowed versus women, the dynamics behind their thought process in adjusting to a facility is really different. And that's one thing you have to understand. They're not as sociable. Most men are not as sociable. Most men have a lot of pride, like us. We may not want to be seen with a walker. We're talking about one of our friends didn't want to use a walker or a cane because it made them look old.
Yeah.
But I had somebody that they wanted a scooter. I said, well, but scooter is more manly. It's like, I'm going to be independent. You know, so the dynamics behind the psychology behind a male versus a female adjusting or even wanting to go to an assisted living or even an adult day center takes some time. I always tell people, families, plant the seeds and walk slowly because it's something that is foreign to them and they've been in their home for 60, 70, maybe all their life. So it's something that we always going to have objections a lot of the time. Very few times do we ever see, right, Todd, that he says, okay, let's go. That is not going to happen. So work with a professional to find a way to plant the seed, ease the pain, ease the objections, and walk them through what his life is like. Because most people, when they get there, they love it. Have you seen in a recent commercial that they're interviewing seniors? He goes, and one of the most common things that I've experienced little on the commercial is, I wished I moved in here earlier, because it is a social life it was huge. We had a family member move in one, never wanted to go to one, but after about 2 years, we had to call to make sure she was available to have dinner with us. So all these things that you may have experienced yourself, but every family situation experience is just so all over the place, so different.
Yes, totally agree. I mean, there's really no set. I mean, there are standards for what's available in the services, but each facility has its own profile and its own personality. You know, even among the plazas, for instance, you know, there's quite a, I think Plaza has 6 or 7 of them, and each of their locations is a little different. So like Percy's saying, you know, you really got to suss it out and feel it out, get a sense of, you know, who's there, and it becomes sort of a who's who as well, you know, a big social scene. So assisted living now, switching gears to the next one. There's rarely an assisted living that is not also combined with an independent living facility, right? It's an easy transition to go from independent to assisted because they're both working with people around the same level of care need. And so in assisted living, you know, you start to encounter residents that need some assistance. And it goes on up until actually quite a bit of moderate assistance for their, at least their really kind of high risk activities like showering or even, you know, going to the toilet. But typically most assisted living facilities are still going to require the resident to be ambulatory. So that becomes sort of a cutoff for quite a few of them where if my brother is starting to not be ambulatory, then the administration is going to say, look, I mean, he may need to start thinking about other options. And so that's one of the downsides in that there's sort of a ceiling to assisted living for what they can provide. And if I really want to stay there and I have these higher needs, a lot of the facilities will present an option to say you can stay, but you need to hire a private caregiver. And that's where the cost becomes very prohibitive. Like I was saying, you know, the private caregiver is essentially the cost of home care on top of the assisted living monthly fee, on top of, say, it's a life care facility where like I've already put in $1 million into Kahala Nui's unit. So that cost really becomes a factor when somebody starts to need more around the clock care. And typically in assisted living, again, the basic premise is that the residents are not going to receive a lot of hands-on care. You know, that's not what they're designed to do. And so the staff ratio might not be very adequate, the staff ratio to residents, because you know, you might have one caregiver that is managing a floor as opposed to, say, a few residents. But it is still a very lively environment. They've got great activities in the assisted side. Usually these facilities are very well maintained, you know, like we're talking hotel level, wonderful fixtures and everything. And there's a really great program for their routines and their services. They organize outings and a lot of events, even, you know, during COVID. So I am a fan of assisted living, but there is just a point where maybe it's just not appropriate anymore. And if you then go from assisted living or away from that, then you start getting into the residential side of facilities. And so adult residential care homes, there's kind of a complex matrix of, you know, big homes, small homes, expanded care, regular care. I'm not going to get too in depth with that, but for all care homes, the basic value proposition is it's 24/7 assistance. So as opposed to being in assisted living where, you know, they're not really designed to help me day and night, or, you know, just for perhaps something that comes up like I need to shower or I have an emergency. A care home is designed to be a constant presence for the resident. And within the care home industry or our niche, you know, you have some facilities that provide very light assistance, and then you have other facilities that will be very, very hands-on. So like Percy is saying, you have to go out, interview them, kind of see it in person and get a sense of, you know, what is your service overnight? You know, do you have a caregiver that's going to be awake and available? But for these residents, you know, they really do need that 24/7 care. And also we do have some residents, I should say, that at my facility, they're still relatively independent, but they don't want to feel like they're in a big hotel and they have to walk several, you know, 100 feet or go down to a different floor for their meals. So some residents really do enjoy that smaller setting. In fact, quite a few people do, especially if they're coming from home. And so that's a nice proposition too for care homes. The downside is it's a major fragmented, you know, part of our industry. Just care homes alone, and there's a different type that we'll talk about in a sec. There's something like about 458 in the state, and so there's a huge difference in how you perceive the quality or the quality of it. A lot of the homes are out a little bit more on the west side, so sometimes the location is not as convenient for families, and it's very much a mom and pop kind of niche. So those are care homes. Percy, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, well, I wanted to kind of backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
We see, like you said, mentioned Todd earlier, you know, we get calls saying my mother's gonna be discharged Friday, it's Tuesday. One thing I can talk from personal experience is that we had a client that from rehab, they were at the hospital, they needed a rehab, so discharged from the hospital, went to rehab. They were looking at placing him in the facility, but in the meantime, at the rehab facility, and I don't want to knock rehab facilities, that whenever you have a loved one or a client or a patient go into any kind of a setting, you need to take inventory of their property. And the reason why I say that is that a close friend lost a wedding ring. And they said, well, I said, well, what's the inventory like? Did she have it? And said they didn't do the inventory. When they left the facility and they went into a new facility, they need to have an inventory, because through the interview process, we knew that that person that did the rehab was lying when he said he did not see a ring, because another lady said they saw a ring, but they couldn't prove anything. So lost the ring. They couldn't file a report with the police or with the facility. So that's a really good tip. And I didn't think about that before either myself, until this happened about a year ago. But taking inventory of your personal property, especially, you shouldn't really take any jewelry into a facility unless you really need to have that, but make sure to take a picture of it and itemize it in the inventory of your personal items. So
excellent point, Percy. No, excellent. And that also goes for when one has to call EMS and get hospitalized. You know, jewelry, that kind of thing is a little less common, but eyeglasses, something as basic as eyeglasses get kind of lost in that ambulance to the hospital process. And more, maybe more costly, or like hearing aids and other aids like that, you know, for some reason, the EMS personnel really don't care about that. And then we end up, you know, getting called that if a resident goes to the hospital, then they ask us, hey, were there hearing aids with you, or did the ambulance take them with the hearing aid? So excellent point, Percy. Okay, so residential care homes are going to be out in the community in an actual residential neighborhood, and they're typically very small. And we'll get into that a bit more. The main thing again is that it's 24/7 though. And then let me get to the next slide. Then we're going to talk about a couple of these that I don't want to get too in depth, but intermediate care and skilled nursing care, these are going to be that kind of larger facility that feels clinical. So people don't tend to really think about staying there long term because it is a very unpleasant environment to assume that I'm going to live out my days for years in an intermediate care facility. But the main value proposition is that it does provide some nursing care for chronic conditions that are a little bit more intensive. And it's just, you know, nurses are available 24/7, but does one really need that, as opposed to being in maybe a more comfortable environment that's not as institutional? This intermediate care is provided in a skilled nursing care facility. So they're actually the same beds, but it has to do more with insurance. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So skilled nursing facilities, like Percy was saying, you know, somebody goes to rehab or they have to go to a nursing home for something very short term and acute or post-acute for care. Say if I, you know, need to, I had a resident just last month who had some internal bleeding. So he went to the hospital, and before returning to my care home, you know, the doctor said, why don't we have him go and get a little bit of rehab? And so that's what a skilled nursing facility is. It's kind of a bridge between the residential and the hospital. So residents will receive that direct nursing 24/7, and then it is covered by Medicare, but up until a certain point, at which point they have to pay privately under intermediate care, or they can be discharged. It's not a very nice setting, you know, downsides to it. And this rotating patients quickly really has a lot to do with insurance, because once Medicare stops, then, you know, somebody is either the facility is going to have to pay or the family has to pay. So
yeah, Medicare, there's a limit on 100 days, Todd.
Yeah.
So a lot of times you have to be your own family advocate there, keeping track of days, talking to a social worker or a nurse assistant. I had a situation where a family member, when I found out an uncle was at a facility, I knew him relatively well, and I got a call from my cousin saying, you know what, uncle's not getting better. He really doesn't like the place. He's not really eating that much. I said, well, he was a pretty prominent guy in town. He made the decisions. He was the leader, and now he can't do the things he normally can do. So for men, like I said, in different, they shut down a little bit more. I said, be very careful. If he's in rehab on Medicare, if he does not get better, you're going to discharge him, because you're there to get better. And sure enough, 2 days later, they discharge him. Be very careful. Some facilities, you know, it could be a day or half a day saying, oh, we have a bed open. Now it's not open. And that happened to that family as well. They said they had a bed. At the end of the day, when Friday came, there was no bed. They had to quickly find another facility. So always keep your options open. Do not say, okay, I'm going to stay here, because that there may not be there tomorrow, tonight. But be very careful about that. A lot of these places don't have a nurse always on staff. They should be, depending on the facility. But a lot of times they're going to have regular CNAs available to them, or nurse assistants. So be very cognizant of the client ratio or the patient ratio to the care, and really be their advocate to find out their needs, wants, concerns. Are they being turned in the bed? How are they doing with feeding, things like that?
Yeah, great points, Percy. I mean, it's this is a time when somebody is in rehab, a time to be very present, because there's a lot of factors. And when we say 100 days that Medicare covers, it doesn't mean that everyone's entitled to that. As Percy was saying, if somebody is not showing improvement in their therapy regimen, that's when the facility can no longer justify a reimbursement to Medicare. And that's when the facility says to the family, hey, your dad is no longer, the term they always use is plateaued. His rehab has plateaued, and therefore we cannot, justify charging this back to Medicare, and therefore you need to, either go out or you can pay privately, which is, average about 400 to 460 a day here in Honolulu. So Percy is absolutely right. You have to be very present and advocate, and also, with their social workers, advocate that, hey, I do see some progress with my dad. Can we work this out? So, it takes a lot of pushing and pulling at times, because the facility is under a lot of pressure themselves to rotate their resident or their patients for the next person. And there's little pitfalls that, it's good for you to work with professionals. And if your clients are looking for, or in this situation, they really ought to consult with somebody. They can call Percy or myself and say, what are some of the things I should be worried about in this specific situation? So moving on, adult foster care actually is another type of kind of care home. And it's, the technical term is down there, community care foster family home. But people mix it up all the time with care homes, because it seems very similar. They're residential. They're typically in somebody's house that's been converted into this kind of care facility. But the main difference is they're separately regulated. One is, well, now they're all under DOH, Department of Health, but they have separate laws that regulate them. And the main value proposition I find for foster care is that they are required to accept one of either two, but typically one of three residents they have must be covered through Medicaid. And Medicaid is not an optional thing for foster care homes to work with. Whereas in care homes, we do have the option to say, yes, we will accept Medicaid payments and reimbursements, or no, we will not. Foster care homes must accept Medicaid payments for at least one of their 2 or 3 residents. And then the other 2 residents are paying privately, cash out of pocket. So, it is one of the few options that families have if they're looking for a Medicaid placement. And at the same time, it's also supposed to be considered a nursing service, a little bit of a more higher level of care. So the environment is going to be very intimate. We're talking 3 or fewer residents. And typically families are going to consider this for the Medicaid aspect. Otherwise, they usually open their search up to care homes as well. The downsides is that, again, just like care homes, we're talking an individual nurse or an individual care, nurse aide who has decided to open up their home. And so the conditions are usually pretty basic. And some people love their specific caregiver, but if you go right across the street or you go to a different home, the quality and the perception of the quality really varies. So it's very much an important thing to talk to the caregiver, to see what the home looks like. And immediately families kind of will pick up little red flags if they say, if the caregiver says, well, we only allow visitation if you call us in advance, or if you, come at this specific time. Now, unfortunately, with COVID, everybody's on to that. But before COVID and maybe moving after COVID, if a caregiver says that kind of thing, it immediately sets up some red flags for families to say, can I trust this person? Are they going to be open with their communication? But the nursing care that's involved and the Medicaid payment that they accept is really the primary motivator for families to consider foster care homes. Like regular care homes too, it is a pretty full service, so they will include meals, they'll include all the medication management, and there are extra fees for a third-party case management who has to oversee each resident. Lastly, there's a couple other options. Oh, I'm sorry, Percy, anything to add to that?
No, I think most important thing, I always look at it from a negative point of view, being in lending.
Okay. Oh yeah.
Okay, I always look at it that way, because if we can address the negative things that might go on, we're good. But if we go in there thinking, oh, this is great, it's really, really nice, the place is beautiful, thinking that's always gonna be like that, necessarily always is not. So I always look for the red flags, like you mentioned, Todd. When can I visit? Who do I call?
Yeah.
What's your protocol for an emergency?
Yeah.
We had a situation, a couple of years back where the person fell down. There was only one lady in the home, was not the owner, and I told the family, call 911. So the person in the facility said, okay, let me check with the owner first. I said, no, call 911 right now. That's the protocol. You need to do that now. And finally did, but it took them about half an hour to decide what to do. Also, your advocacy, be very careful. A lot of times people will get upset if you complain or talk or question things. So understand it is their home, it is their business, but just be very understanding that it's not easy to care for somebody 24/7. But any complaints go through the Department of Health. There's a long-term care ombudsman, John McDermott, who Todd and I both know. He's the one that investigates. And then what's the other one? Okra for complaints or do investigations?
Well, I mean, usually it's long-term care ombudsman as your first line of defense. The Department of Health Office of Healthcare Assurance is the regulatory body for care facilities. So you could complain to them as well.
Yeah, but be very careful. And like I said, I like to be like a detective, ask a lot of probing questions to find out, really, are these guys really honest and upfront with us? Are they going to really care for people, or they're just doing it for the money? When it comes to Medicaid, if you want to complain, if you're on Medicaid, be understanding that I always tell people when it comes to Medicaid for long-term care, he who pays for the care controls the care. So basically what I'm saying that you kind of lost control of the care for your loved one if they're on Medicaid, because you're not paying for it. So understand that. And we have great facilities that take Medicaid. And of course, like in any industry, you're going to get a couple of bad apples. But be understanding of that going forward if you're looking at placement into a adult foster care property.
Yeah.
Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, great point, Percy. And I haven't really said it earlier, and I don't have it in this presentation, but the size of the facility really determines a lot of what we're talking about in terms of perception of quality and or actual quality. The biggest gift that a caregiver can give to a family is that peace of mind, to know that their loved one is being adequately and properly cared for, that no corners are being cut. And as Percy was saying, the biggest gift that families can give to a caregiver is their trust, because it is a very selfless task to be providing care to other people, especially someone who's not your own loved one. And caregivers suffer from all sorts of ailments related to caring for other people. So to put on top of that a family's kind of constant suspicion or distrust towards them really can sour the relationship extremely quickly. That's why it's important to get into it's like a marriage. It's like getting into the right marriage up front and talk about these things up front before getting into that arrangement, because there are some really damaging things that can happen through the process. So Percy makes a great point. And going back to the size, the smaller a facility is, the more intimate, the more personal, the more kind of casual it feels. But the downsides to that are that it could be, a little bit inconsistent, or, hey, is there going to be a caregiver doing this today, or did they not schedule that? There's fewer resources in a smaller facility to kind of go around and set up these processes and their systems to make sure that there's that consistent feel. On the flip side, you go to the opposite end of the spectrum. A big facility is going to really feel like they got their act together, well, hopefully not all of them, but the bigger they are, the more it feels like they've got great processes. There's a team of people, so that if somebody calls out sick, there's somebody that can take over real quickly. But the downside to a big facility, of course, is feeling less in control as a family member of what happens. And this has become really gone to heads during the time of COVID right now, where people who live in bigger facilities, or family members who send their loved one to bigger facilities, really feel kind of powerless over, what say they have over visitation policy. Can I see my mom? They make me wear a mask, or they make me take a test before I come, or I'm through a glass pane, I can only see them. And so, I tell families right now, depending on their own desire to want to be involved or to kind of dictate how the care goes, size is a huge aspect of this. I run a care home. I'm the first to say that maybe a care home is not good for them, and maybe they should consider a foster care home, because if my mom represents 33.33% of all of the people they serve, now I have that much more influence over how they run their operation, right? So it's an important factor, and I wasn't going to bring that up in this presentation, so thank you, Percy, for that. These are just some other options that are available that we'll just kind of go through quickly, but a CCRC community, continuing care retirement community and life care facility. Think of like Arcadia, Pohainani, Kahala Nui. Yeah, they are going to be an entire spectrum under one campus. Now, it's still going to be separate areas. Independent living is in one area, assisted is in another, their nursing facility. But it's the entire spectrum. And if it's a life care facility, they typically have a buy-in, right? So Arcadia has a buy-in, Kahala Nui does. Percy knows the figures more than I do.
15 Craigside.
Craigside, that's right. But, so that's convenient, because then that you're under one administration, and there's not going to be having to, moving from one level of care to the next means I have to work with a different management and administration. A benefit of life care facilities too is that they will guarantee my care even if I deplete my cash or liquid assets. My buy-in will then cover for the care. But the downsides is that there's still a little bit of a gap at times where if I'm in assisted living, it's not appropriate for me to go to skilled nursing, because I don't need that nursing care. I just need more kind of hands-on nurse aid assistance. So you'll find a lot of times people are actually paying for private caregivers at Kahala Nui or at Craigside, because they don't offer that really hands-on, day-to-day attention for small things, even just getting out of the chair or feeding or anything like that. But life care facilities are very popular. There's a long wait list for Kahala Nui, and it's a very nice, lively environment, of course. And then there's hospice. Hospice is available through the entire spectrum of facility or location. I can receive hospice services at home or in a facility. Obviously, there's no alternatives to it. And typically, my doctor will assess me and say, look, I think I only have 6 months longevity, but of course that can be reassessed. And I have some long-term hospice residents. I mean, they've lived on for years now with us, but their conditions, are at the point where the doctor says, I think it's not a science, it's more of an art to kind of anticipating somebody's longevity. The downside to hospice, of course, is that it's very unpleasant. And some families, will find themselves in a hospice situation where some illness comes up and they want to address it, but the interventions might not be covered by insurance because this is hospice. We're potentially saying that your dad's going to pass soon. We can't justify having your dad then go for some operation or get some treatment that would be contrary to the premise that they are going to pass, right? And hospice is different from palliative care. Palliative care is a new field that is really growing and gaining steam here in our islands. It's a great service for somebody who's working through some real chronic pain conditions or other conditions that affect their quality of life. And some hospice programs are developing a sort of a hybrid between that as well, where their clients are not necessarily terminal, but they are living with some very serious illness that kind of resembles palliative care. So these are
palliative care is more for pain management.
Yeah.
With the chronic disease. But Todd, I want to go back for the inspection for the life care facilities. It's a buy-in, but please remember, if you haven't experienced yourself, they have to qualify financially.
Great
Every
point.
property is qualifying financially. And you'd be surprised how high that limit is of financial assets they have to have. I've had several clients, oh, you need $1 million in reserves. It's after your buy-in to be able to guarantee that life care. But it's great. I don't know if I would like to do that at some point down the road. I don't know if my wife would come with me. That's the only problem. Because she said, okay, enjoy yourself there. She wants to stay in the home. Yep. So, and I get it. But it's just something that level of care is great in CCRCs. I want to eventually visit them. And if you're not a sociable person, that may not be the best. I've seen many people love, and reason why I want to go is I don't need to drive my car anymore. They have a van that goes someplace every day. They have a sign-up sheet on different activities going on. A lot of them have theaters or conference room if you're still working. Great food. Look at the quality of food, but also the quality of people. I know some facilities don't allow you to wear a tank top or shorts for dinner or lunch, so be careful of that. How local is the food? If you really like local food, I like all types of foods, not a problem for me. But it's really important to understand the different levels of the financial side of that. Obviously, Medicaid is a whole nother story we could probably do down the road, but it's something important. In Hawaii, my research about 5-6 years ago, Hawaii was on a lower third of the spectrum in terms of states that use hospice, and that's not good. I've seen family members myself where they didn't call hospice until that week they passed. It's really important. Nobody wants to think we're gonna die. Nobody wants to say, oh, doctor, can you diagnose me for 6 months or less to live so I can take hospice? That doesn't happen. However, if you notice, a loved one aging, or it was in my case, it was an uncle was aging and losing weight to the point they were down to 80 pounds. You need to think seriously about this. It really, to me, comes down to quality of care. And if hospice steps in, there's only 4 or 5 hospice agencies in the state of Hawaii. And a lot of times the hospital or rehab place they're at will recommend 1 or 2. I recommend you check them all out. I have a lot of experience with most of them, but also with the service they provide at the end of life, because you'd be surprised how many people don't know what's covered. Medicare covers most of it, or all of it in most cases, but need to understand the different options where they need oxygen, a special bed, bandages, medications, understand what their protocol is, with end of life issues. I know this doesn't pertain to care options, but end of life issues. We covered in our magazine the right to die issue, because not all hospice agencies will address that. They will not participate. There's actually a limited amount of pharmacies that will actually administer the drugs for this. So that's another topic we can cover at another time, Greg. But Greg, you had a question earlier before Todd signed on regarding the amount of rooms or the Medicaid beds. Greg, remember what that question was? You still here? Or unmute yourself? No? Okay. Anyway, somebody brought up the issue, a question about issue of clicks and excluding others. Is it less prevalent depending on the number of residents in the facility? Yeah, I mean, I think so. The more people you have, the more people looking at you, how you dress, what you eat, you know, what you do with your time. Do you shave every day? How do you dress? All of the above. Obviously, smaller facilities could do the same though. So
yeah, maybe another way to think of that too is when a family is touring these places, the basic premise of an assisted living or independent living facility is that the residents are independent. They're able to take care of themselves and have grooming themselves. Whereas when you get to facilities that offer more of that hands-on assistance 24/7, then the individuals typically are less able to keep up their appearances and or communicate as easily. Maybe as you get into care homes, you'll end up with people that have more cognitive issues or dementia. And so it is really important to envision how one's loved one will fit in that space where, if it's a large facility and everybody is kind of independent, then of course they're going to feel excluded because they can't keep up. And that is an issue. We had a resident who was kicked out of our facility because of his wife needed the care. So then the kids moved him to Kalakaua Gardens. And unfortunately, because he was living with Parkinson's and had a very difficult time eating, was very slow to eat, none of the other residents really wanted to spend time with him. So he felt very much like a small fish in a big pond, whereas when he was at our care home, the caregivers would say, oh, Papa, you're so able to do these things, right? And because the standards are different, the general kind of level of everyone's ability is different. And so that is a huge factor to consider as families are going through this process.
I would also recommend, most of the places have a respite care. So ask them, will they do respite care for my dad? I'm going on a trip or business trip or Vegas. I believe a lot of them will anywhere from a week to 3 weeks for respite care. But you'll be charged by the day or by the week, and it can be costly. So, but it might be worth it for you. Todd, there's a question here. What's the cost range for caregivers? Must they be licensed? Same question about cost of adult daycare, independent living assisted.
Perfect. Let's move on here. So let me address that question in a little bit. These are the next 3 slides are just real basic comparisons of the different options we just talked about. So custodial care or care assistance with what's called activities of daily living, ADLs. These settings are going to be the ones where they're primarily addressing those needs. Whereas these other homes will address more nursing needs or medical attention. And so it's important to, off the bat, I hear about families saying, well, my dad suffers from dementia and he's got his heart condition. And we went to the plaza to look at it. But it's kind of thinking, well, the plaza is not really set up to provide those types of services. So the custodial care is your kind of day-to-day interactions, whereas medical care is going to be, nursing, services for more complex conditions. That also relates to this pay type. So private pay out of pocket versus providers. And by providers, I mean specifically either Medicare or Medicaid. These facilities on the left here are generally speaking only going to take cash. And then for the right facilities, you can get reimbursements for Medicare up to 100 days, but that's not a long-term option, obviously. And then I should say that for private insurance, long-term care insurance, and Percy might have more to add to this, typically speaking, long-term care insurance will be covering the cost of the facilities on the left here under private pay.
Well, not all the cost of care, but
not all
depending on
of
the
it, or-
policy they have,
Okay.
they'll pay a good portion of it, hopefully, but depending on the policy, and that's a whole nother
Yeah, it's a whole nother topic.
webinar on this, because I experienced this personally with my own mother, who just got on claim a few months back, but it is a whole process that needs to be understood as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not an expert on long-term care insurance, but on the receiving end, where my residents do have policies, I see a kind of across the board different types of policies. Some people will reimburse a few thousand a month. We have some residents who have bought into policies where it reimburses like almost 10,000 a month, but then they fluctuate based on the duration of care or maybe the type of services that are being provided. So Percy will have to arrange for another webinar for that. And then the other comparison here is just the setting, the feel. What is it like being in there, right? And so when I say residential, I really mean being in a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood like we have, and communal could be in that residential area, but typically we're talking a building that has several floors and or a large space where you have people together. And then obviously intermediate nursing or skilled nursing is going to feel very clinical. We're talking 8-foot hallways, call lights, double bedrooms, that sort of thing. That it's very difficult to differentiate a nursing facility from a hospital. So going back to cost here, we're not going to go through each one of these lines here. I think the main thing that we didn't really cover that's on this slide here is just typically the staff ratio that we talked about on the second row. As you're in an environment where the residents or the patients or the participants are meant to be more independent, then you have fewer caregivers per resident. And so you can see here, like in an assisted living facility, there may be one nurse aide for 16 to 24 people. Right? And that's okay, because those people don't need that assistance. But once my dad is at the plaza and he's beginning to need more kind of basic assistance for walking or feeding, then that staff ratio is going to suddenly become an issue. Whereas when you have the residential setting, this ARCH residential care home or foster care home, you see that the ratios are much more generous, maybe one caregiver to a few people. And then the ultimate for staff ratio is home care. I have one parent and I have one caregiver, and they're one-to-one, right? Somebody asked about cost, and the next slide actually is a graph. So it's going to be a visual there, but there's daycare and daycare and nursing facilities charge by day. Home care charges by hour, and then the rest are charging per month. Some of them have various fees involved with buy-ins or other services. But at the very bottom, so I think, Percy, you're asking about capacity. This is the approximate number just on Oahu of capacity that we have here. And so home care is kind of hard to determine, how many actual home care givers there are and people that are receiving home care in their residence. But there's actually not a lot of capacity. And to be honest, in the residential side, the capacity is dropping. It's a real issue that hopefully with Kupuna Care Pair, I'm able to solve help to solve, because people are finding a lot of regulatory hurdles or maybe just general business issues being able to brand and market their services to people. So, when I started in 2011, the number of care homes out there on Oahu were closer to about 450, and it's dropped since 2011. So, you see these kind of macro issues that can really affect one individual as they're looking for the services. The next slide here is just meant to look very strikingly visually dramatic, which is look at the cost compared to the different categories of care. And I've arranged this basically by the amount of assistance somebody needs. Foster care is often its own because then you're working with Medicaid. But as somebody begins to need more assistance, it becomes more costly, just flat out, right? So home care, for instance, you're getting charged per hour. And at 1 to 4 hours a day, that's relatively maybe manageable, maybe 4,000 a month. But as you get to needing 12 hours a day at $25 to $35 an hour, then we're talking really big money. And that's when a point where families really ought to ask themselves, look, I know dad wants to stay at home, but cost-wise, are we getting a lot of value out of this? So maybe we could think about a residential facility where my dad can receive not only the hands-on, but meals are included, activities are included, transportation is included to the doctor. So it's a wide range, as you can see, obviously, and within each category, they will charge differently as well. But I just want to give you kind of a visual understanding of the differences in the cost, and that really comes down to how much care one needs on an hourly basis or daily basis, and or medically, in the red column here with nursing, it's always going to be quite expensive in those facilities. Percy, I'm sure you have something to add.
Yeah, well, the questions here, these are all Hawaii rates. We're probably number 3 or 4 highest in the country in terms of cost of care, but these are all Hawaii rates. Todd can share a little bit before we end his website that calculated and actually talked to most of these facilities to get the actual rates here. There are a couple firms in town that do offer services for you to sort through the different properties. Unfortunately, the companies in Hawaii really only will help you with properties that pay them a commission. They don't always show you all the available properties because they don't get paid a commission on. And that's something really important to understand and embrace. Not that they're doing a bad job, but just to realize that they may not be showing you everything. Todd's website will have all the facilities, but probably hiring a case manager. I've helped families, but I don't charge people, but my time is limited. But finding a professional that understands, there are a couple of nonprofits out there that could probably help you with that are in our magazine. And then the other question was, yes, they have to be licensed. They have to be, care homes have to be licensed. And then cost of adult daycare, all of are in this graph right here, different levels of care. But I would recommend always taking a tour, bring a financial advisor, depending on how much experience they have. Make sure they take it a fiduciary responsibility where they're not trying to push their own low agendas or their own personal opinions. That's one thing I find very often is that people will put their own opinions into the equation. It shouldn't happen that way. It's got to be what that loved one needs or wants. But it is time consuming, and everybody has a different idea of what's a quality of care. But it's just something that I think is really important to grasp. And I always tell people that when I do workshops that most families will spend more time planning a vacation to Vegas than planning their long-term care needs. And it is so true. But please recommend that. Can you comment on whether POST is likely to be honored in these facilities? POST is a physician order for life-sustaining treatment. That typically is in the home setting. If you move into a facility, they typically will have their medical directive. Todd, you can probably, because you have a facility, how do you folks handle that?
It is typically honored. Generally speaking, at least when it comes to a care home, like we know from the Advanced Healthcare Directive and the POST what the residents' wishes are to either call the ambulance or not. Once the ambulance does come, they will absolutely honor the POST. But at that point, there's already been one filter in between. The key is the facility has to be organized enough to know what the POST says before calling the ambulance. And so you'll find that many facilities, the bigger ones at least, do have that level of organization to keep that in file, and then when something comes up, they can retrieve it very quickly. But generally speaking, in the licensed facilities, everyone will honor that. It is when you get to the more residential setting, caregivers and these small homes do really worry about liability, because they generally can feel quite powerless being a small operator in this big system. So I think that I haven't really heard of any horror stories where the pulse is not honored in a facility.
Todd, the last question was about the agency that
Regulatory,
oversees the facilities.
Yeah, so the Department of Health, Office of Health Care Assurance, and they are the licensing body and the regulatory facility. They have different areas. So one is going to handle Medicare facilities only, and then the other department is going to, or the other office is going to handle, or the section is going to handle care homes, assisted living, and that sort of thing. They're not going to be that involved on the family level to be able to assist families in sorting through all of this. They usually rely on just market forces to push that along. It's also
long-term care ombudsman.
Yeah, the long-term care ombudsman. Yeah, and I just have to say, I mean, like they are an office of, I can't imagine. I think they have more than 30 people in the Office of Healthcare Assurance, regulating thousands, literally thousands of providers here. So they're traditionally been very understaffed, and they do have, at least on the state licensing side, which is the non-Medicare side, they have somebody in charge who's a bit younger, a little bit more kind of forward thinking in terms of technology and modernizing their processes. But it's not an agency that families really rely on, and to be honest, some care facilities either, because it can feel kind of uncomfortable trying to work with the people that are regulating us. But to be honest, it shouldn't. And I think that their processes are getting a lot better, so they're relying on more electronic communication, and through the pandemic, they've been able to assist more. But I generally, don't tell families to expect much support from OCA, Office of Healthcare Assurance.
So Todd's website is kupunacarepair.com.
Yeah.
It works relatively good for now. It is a work in process.
Yep.
For himself, but they have all the list of all the facilities statewide that you can find all in one place, which is fantastic, because
Just a map.
Department of Health has that, but it's all splintered, and you got to really look for that. He's got a cool map. If you can pull it, if you can go to his website, that has all the places along the island. In fact, we checked in Manoa that there's only one, right?
For
foster care.
For one foster care over by Manoa School, and then a couple smatterings of home care homes. But it's, and like Percy's saying, it's meant to be all inclusive. Somebody asked a question about companies that will advise families, and like Percy was saying, those companies will only steer people to facilities that they have a contract to receive a commission for, right? The other issue with that is that those agencies are operated by human beings, and we can only operate as quickly as we are able to make phone calls or talk on the, speak. Whereas hopefully what I'm trying to accomplish here is to create efficiencies with automation through technology, such that I can sift through the thousands of providers to say, okay, my mom really wants a private bedroom. Well, let me just filter that. And then my mom has a budget range of this much to this much. Okay, I'll filter that. And hopefully then it will sort the entire list down to, let's say, as opposed to hundreds of care homes, just say 6 or 8 of them that I would call from that point. And then of course, I can filter by the ones that actually have vacancy now, because that's a huge issue.
That's a really big issue. So, and then my website is generations808.com. All our past issues are in there. Our radio shows, which Todd has been on, and our webinars. It's a great resource, and we've got a list of a lot of the facilities as there as well. So, there was, let's see, one more comment there. Can
Yeah.
you type the website? Okay, Todd.
Yeah,
what's-
I'm assuming Kupuna Care Pair. So if you go to, let me just write it in here, kupunacarepair.com, then, you know, you can take a look. And like I was saying earlier to Charlene or somebody else, you know, in a few weeks, I'm going to be actually launching more of a kind of like an Airbnb style of database where you can filter each facility and get a sense of that. But there's a lot of issues that are involved in this process. You know, it's really highly recommended that you steer your clients to professionals that can provide, you know, more hands-on or more face-to-face consultation and perhaps you know, expertise from being in the industry. This presentation, we wanted to give you a really high-level overview of what's available so that you can you know, not have to advise your clients in that regard, but rather just kind of know the general broad swaths of what's available. I don't know if anyone else has other questions, and I know that we don't want to take up more of your time if you got somewhere to go, but I could talk about this all day.
Yes.
Yeah.
But, yeah. If no questions, thank you very much. You can find us online or just email us or you can Google us. That's what people all do all the time. They Google my name or Todd's name and go, okay, I know who you are. So Greg, Jaylene, everybody, thank you so much. And God bless everybody. Get vaccinated and be your advocate for your loved one there. But I appreciate your time. Todd, great
Percy.
job, Todd. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
Percy,
hey,
Todd,
Percy.
thank you guys so much. And everyone else, be aware that you can get information about Percy's contact information and Todd's information, partly through the announcement for this event. And also the event will be likely available in the next few weeks or so, if you want to see it again or forward it to some other loved one. Everybody, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Mahalo,
Todd.
you guys.
Thanks,
See ya.
everybody. Aloha.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good job.